Hello, I'm Margaret Ann Takashusky, Director of the New Haven Museum, and we are delighted to have you with us this evening. The Elm City celebration of the 200th birth anniversary of author and park designer Donald Grant Mitchell continues with tonight's talk, Reveries of a Landscape Designer, Donald Grant Mitchell, and the Path to the New Haven Park System. The goal has been to help the public understand this complex, creative, and talented individual and instill an appreciation for Mitchell's literary and landscape design contributions to the city of New Haven. We thank Barbara Lamb for being the organizing force behind the celebration and invite you to visit the website donaldgrantmitchell.com for more information and upcoming events. On Saturday here at the museum's Whitney Library from 12 to 5, our librarian Ed Serrato will have a display of maps, scrapbooks, photos, and other materials from our Donald Grant Mitchell papers, along with a pop-up exhibit researched and produced by Barbara Lamb. Any questions you have during tonight's presentation, please add them to the chat. Our speaker this evening is landscape designer Leslie Martino. Like Mitchell, Leslie's career path has been both circuitous and novel. After graduating from Georgetown University and positions with Dow Jones and Company and the New York Times Magazine Group, Leslie started her family and began to follow her passion for garden design and history and all things horticultural. She completed graduate level certificate studies at Harvard University's Landscape Institute in Landscape Design and Landscape History. She is a landscape designer with NatureWorks Horticultural Services in Northford, Connecticut, and she's also served as chair of the Connecticut chapter of the National Garden Club's Landscape Study School. She regularly speaks on various aspects of horticulture, landscape design, and landscape history. Recently, she was the keynote speaker at the Federated Garden Clubs of Connecticut's annual meeting, discussing Frederick Law Olmsted, his park designs, design principles, and relevance today. She's also a floral design instructor, National Garden Club Master Level Flower Show judge, and an award-winning floral designer. Welcome, Leslie.
Thanks, Margaret Ann. I'm so excited to be here tonight. I do want to thank you and Barbara Lamb for coordinating everything, and Barbara in particular for shepherding this whole celebration of Donald Grant Mitchell's birth. And I'm excited to be a part of the discussion. So thank you for having me. All right, I'll switch over to share screen. All right, I think I'm in the right place. I'm excited because so often we've been talking about Donald Grant Mitchell from the standpoint of his literary career and of all of his work in Westville in particular and his farm at Edgewood. So this is another aspect that I don't think has been fully explored. And I was lucky to get the idea from the archivist Tom Peters at Hopkins School, who suggested that I find out a bit more about the owner of that house down on Forest Road, who was the designer of the New Haven Park System. And I said, who knew? So off I went in doing my research. And in looking at his park design work, I found that his literary work and his work at Edgewood was just as important as the work that he did on the parks, because it enabled him to get to that position. So I'm going to review the things that led up to the park design work and then discuss some of the designs themselves. And I'm starting with this slide that's a picture of East Rock, and it's featured in William Cullen Bryant's 1874 Picturesque America book that was a 2-volume series that was reissued or reprinted in 1974. But when it was created at a time, obviously, when we had no other way of knowing about the picturesque landscapes and the diversity of the landscapes in America in any other way than to have traveled or to have seen them in pictures in some way. So this was a very important book, and the emphasis was on the picturesque. And as you see in this example, you have an industrialized city behind of New Haven, but it's subordinate to the landscape itself and the picturesque nature of this bucolic kind of hunting scene on the East Rock. And that's really what a group of individuals were really hearkening to just before the centennial of the country, was looking back at, oh my gosh, where did we come from? Because what's happening in our cities with all of the growth and industrialization. So this was really part of a movement recognizing the power and the beauty of nature. And Donald Grant Mitchell was right in there with this philosophy. So I thought this was a great way to start and kind of foreshadowing the first part of New Haven. So here's a few shots of Donald Grant Mitchell, early career, mid-career, and late career. And I could spend a whole hour just talking about him as a person. And I tried to, in my rehearsals for this, really narrow it down to key points, because there's so much that you can read in his biography and so much that people have talked about in other presentations. So I will summarize as succinctly as I possibly can, but there's so much to this man. He was brought up in Connecticut in the Salem, Norwich area, and grew up in the country, appreciating farming, fishing, hunting, part of the prominent family, the Mitchell family. His father was a Yale graduate minister, and his grandfather, Chief Justice of the state of Connecticut, and his namesake fought in the Revolutionary War. And his mother's side was the Woodbridge side of the family. So there was a great connection to Yale College, and he went to Yale, graduated at age 19, and was valedictorian of his class. So extremely smart fellow, great sense of humor, very shy, very sickly growing up. And by the time he graduated from Yale, had lost both of his parents and several of his siblings, and it was questionable as to how long he would live. So after graduating, he tried his hand at several things before trying to figure out what am I going to do, and what do I want to make a living at. And he went back to the home farm, tried farming, he tried studying law, he tried writing, and ended up in Europe. And while in Europe, he recovered from his tuberculosis and became a walker, and did his grand tour of Europe by walking, and walked 20 to 30 miles often in a single day. But he studied the landscape, much as Olmsted did, studied the landscape, he studied art, he studied architecture, and he wrote about it and was published. And so he really enjoyed this traveling aspect. And when he came back to the United States, he traveled some more and he wrote, and in 50 and 51 published his top bestsellers, Reveries of a Bachelor and Dream Life. And that really skyrocketed him as for his reputation in the literary world. And he was well known and published under the name of Ick Marvel, and really enjoyed this view of the sentimentality of growing up and thinking about life and making decisions. And so he just took what he knew and took what he was thinking and wrote about it. Throughout his career, he was a lecturer, whether it be on art, architecture, philosophy, barns and farming sheds, and things like that. So he was so well versed in a variety of subjects. Additionally, he was a self-taught cartographer, artist, architect, landscape gardener, and he drew the map that you see on the right of Norwich from a childhood memory when he was 8 years old. When he was older, and he recollected fishing holes and swimming holes and things that were important to him. And what's been very interesting in talking to Barbara and looking at his maps is that they're remarkably accurate. And he's doing this all from memory. So quite an interesting fellow. He ended up, after his fame from writing those books, met his wife-to-be at Washington Irving's home, Sunnyside on the Hudson. And she was Mary Pringle from Charleston, South Carolina. And that could be a whole nother story. But they married and went off to Venice and worked in the consulate there, and went to Paris. then came back. Upon coming back, sought a ideal home, and most people are familiar with the story of the advertisement that he wrote in terms of what he was looking for. And he really was looking for a place that was close to a city, but in the country, and really it's country life within city reach. So that proximity to a city, but with all the country trappings. And he talked about light, hillside, water, views, all of those things, and found those at Edgewood. And his life went from there. So let me just focus back in on his written work, just to give you a feeling for what he was doing. The things highlighted in yellow, you don't have to be able to read all of the names of these things, but I wanted to highlight the things that he wrote that were related to landscape gardening and beautification of home and farm life. And they appear, some things appeared in periodicals and were serialized and turned into books. So there's some overlap there, but you get a sense there in the middle of his life that that's really where his focus was. And later he continued to write, but his writing and the focus and the way he wrote did change over time. And he was not considered, I mean, I never heard of him when I was studying literature and going to school. And not many people have, unless they really are studying and majoring in literature, would understand his reputation and this sentimental type of writing and his style of writing. And by the time of his death, he was not nearly as popular as in the middle of his career or in the beginning of his career even. And I found this article that really talks and characterizes his writing, I thought, very nicely, that was written after his death. And in these diverse forms, one element is ever present: the companionableness of the author. His books have rank in our memories because they are sincere, gracious effusions from the heart of this venerable lover of nature, lover of men, and lover of the best in literature. I think that sums it up so well about all aspects of his life. A kind and gentle soul, and very reflective, and very focused on sharing that with other people. To that end, he really, in his writings about landscape gardening, you could say they were part autobiographical essay, part domestic doctrine or treatise, and then pattern books for how-tos and giving you ideas about how you could improve or how you could create an aesthetic, an adornment for your property, no matter the scale or size of the site itself. And then he goes on to talk about this whole concept of landscape gardening, but it's important to recognize that the concept of landscape gardening was relatively new and really wasn't in the fore of anyone's minds before the creation of Central Park in the late 1850s. So this whole idea of pulling it all together was a new one. And he's saying here that you could have good engineering, you can have good architectural work, and you can have good gardening and good farming, but unless you have a program that unites all of it, an aesthetic or a purpose in what you're trying to do, none of these things come together and gel and create what you're trying to create, no matter the quality of what you have created. And he even delves into the details of how to create and beautify railroad stations, which is really unusual, but you can just picture him taking the train into New York to go meet with a publisher or a client or something, and looking out the window and looking at the train station, and light bulb moments, thinking about, this is my first impression of a town, a village, a city, is stopping at that train station. And boy, if there was landscape gardening, if there was an aesthetic associated with this, it would be that first impression of that place. And how important is that, really, especially in the suburbanation of the country? And then he also considered, from the flip side, of the person who's in the field or has the home nearby those railroad tracks, what are they seeing and how can that be beautified? So these were new ideas. And then the whole concept that John Stilgoe points out of looking at a already done building or landscape and rethinking how to then create something that's more appropriate to convey or market your place or your town and to better the experience of everybody involved. So in the 1860s, so after he bought the farm in 1855, Edgewood, and worked it and really tried to develop what he wanted out of this landscape gardening, he reached out and formed a partnership with William H. Grant, who was a former engineer with Central Park. And the two of them, I'm going to read just the beginning of this advertisement, talked about the undersigned have associated themselves for the conduct of landscape gardening in its connected branches of business, including rural architecture and engineering, then the architectural, horticultural, and sanitary treatment of public and private grounds. They will furnish designs for the laying out of parks, cemeteries, farms, country seats, and village homesteads. They will also plan modifications of country houses and old-fashioned gardens and farms, and devise whatever in their view may be needful by plantations, thinning of woods, readjustment of buildings or enclosures, drainage, and the establishment of walks or drives for the full development of country property, whether the proprietor aims at economic management or picturesque effects. Wow, that just was to have at that point in his career the confidence and the knowledge and to be able to do that in conjunction with an engineer is just fantastic. And what the filler wow comes at the end, where it says Mr. Richard Morris Hunt, has kindly permitted the association of his name with the firm as advising architect. Well, when I read that, I literally screamed with joy and went looking in Richard Hunt's papers and in Donald Grant Mitchell papers for anything relating to their collaboration. And I was very, very sad that I never found anything that showed them having worked together on any particular projects. So I wondered, what is this connection and how did this occur and why did he lend his name to this? And the key I only discovered very recently was with the address of the building. City Office Studio Building, West 10th Street, New York. So it's in Greenwich Village, and I included a picture here. It turns out this building was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, which we know is, builder of grand buildings like the Biltmore Estate. He designed this building specifically in mind for office space for artists and artists of all different types, whether they're painters, sculptors, landscape gardeners. And this building helped launch the reputation of Greenwich Village as an artsy locale. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And they do have other paths crossed, but not in terms of having worked together on any project. So that was a little bit sad. But the bright spot is that Grant and Mitchell did have a park that they worked on together, Allegheny Commons, which is the oldest park in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And they did that in 1867. And it's this quite circuitous park that goes around these blocks, almost like a 9-square grid kind of blocks, and then ends at a summit in the lower left-hand corner that looks very similar to the summit of East Rock Park, where Allegheny Commons had a soldiers and sailors monument as well. But all wasn't hunky-dory, and it demonstrated by this letter to his good friend William Henry Huntington. As yet business hangs away, plenty of good people who want me to come and see their farms and homes and make suggestions, but don't see the propriety in paying for the opinion of that sort, unless reduced to engineer's drawing when they will be willing to pay the draftsman's bill. But the thing may grow, so he's hopeful. Recommend us to any home hunting people. I want vastly to get hold of one big place in some prominent locality and make a picture of it, which will stand fire. So the business itself did not seem to take off. And the two parted ways when Mitchell started editing Hearth and Home with Oliver Wendell Holmes and decided to take on design work on his own separately. And later on, there is mention and there is affiliation of Mitchell at Princeton University. I've never yet, I'm not saying never, I have yet to find actual drawings. I find references to recommendations for paths and connections between buildings, in particular the president, and the same at Smith College. Their library has nothing definitive other than references. So I suspect that there were relationships and friendships that came from other associations that led to work, but in a very general sort, not in a large project sort. So there's also reference to Lafayette College and Lehigh, and I found in a remote library what that was, and it really was, they'd asked Mitchell to write a description of the scene, so really paint the picture verbally of the landscape. It was beautifully written, but it was, alas, it was not a landscape design. So what he really has to hang his hat on is his work at Edgewood. And once he had been there, I think it was 1869 when he published Pictures of Edgewood. And he did that really to reflect upon all of the changes that he had instituted on the property and to show people what the possibilities were. And he printed, self-printed 300 copies of this book. And the Whitney Library does have several copies of this book that is just fascinating to look through. But I'm losing my train of thought there. So he self-published this book to demonstrate exactly what he had done between 1855, when the property looked like this, and then at 1869, those changes. And those changes reflect changes to the topography that affected drainage, affected pasture size and the look. The plantings of trees are now in groupings, as you see, and there's more decorative planting. Let me flip back one more time, and you can see. And the planting around the house, you can see, is there. So he's eliminated a lot of the site problems and then created more aesthetically pleasing additions to accentuate the positive. So the drainage issues are no longer in existence. And then what I've done is kind of superimposed his ideas from rural studies on top of some of these photographs. So this is a gate on his property, and it looks like his children probably playing outside. Rockwood took these pictures. So he's actually, devising these architectural elements and then publishing his actual ideas. So here's more of his ideas, and here's another garden gate. And he did open his property to the public so that they could drive through in carriages to be able to see the example that he was trying to convey. He wasn't trying to sit up on a hill and say, look what I've done. He really did want to share his ideas with people. So this is a view in the back with this, this rustic shed to sit in, and the view that he's captured and changed in that pasture where he's grouped the trees, and all of a sudden you have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. So you've created depth in the landscape. You've created mystery with the planting of those evergreens on the left-hand side and that curving path that sweeps behind them. So you don't know what your eye is going to find beyond that. So there's mystery involved. And he felt that there should be mystery and exploration when you come to somebody's home and property, that it shouldn't all be laid out for you. You should have to do some thinking and some looking and exploring to understand what was going on, and to be intrigued and not have it all show at first blush. This is a view from the top of the hill looking down towards New Haven and the farmland all down in front. And then his garden spaces where he was growing different crops and experimenting with crops so that he could talk about ideal conditions and how to grow certain things. And then there was a very, you saw a decorative farming situation in the last slide, but then there was very natural walking paths as well that went through the woods. And he was an avid walker, hiker. would often walk this path to head up to Woodbridge and walk to Woodbridge, and thought nothing of just going for a walk. And a different view looking in toward the house, and from that pasture direction looking in. So in summary of his landscape design work for residential, I think the focus really has to be on what he created in his own place. Although you can come across writings and letters that do talk about the impact of him helping other people with their grounds. There, I could never find, and I didn't find it at the Whitney Library and at the Beinecke. I was looking too for this magic ledger that would give a list of all of the clients and then all of the work that he had done for those clients. And there was no silver bullet that told me this, but I was really happy to find these kinds of letters in the file. And Gardner Green Hubbard was the founder of the National Geographic Society. So his little PS is, by the way, do you know anyone who give the lecture, the second lecture in the series? He was also the father-in-law of Alexander Graham Bell and president of AT&T. So from an architectural side, he did work with David R. Brown on several projects. The first one that I show here is the Connecticut Cottage from the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, where every state presented a house that represented that state in style, in character, and this was the one representing Connecticut. So Mitchell actually did a watercolor of this house to really identify what he was trying to accomplish to David R. Brown, who drew up the plans, and then somebody else built the house on site. And then if you were at the exhibition, you could actually go inside and tour inside. And exhibitions are just a wonderful, could be a whole nother lecture, but talking about how you communicate what's going on technologically, what's going on internationally, all of those things were shared at these world exhibitions, centennial exhibitions, world's fairs. That was how you communicated beyond your immediate area, beyond those lectures I mentioned or beyond the books. So it was a wonderful way to communicate. And in the competition of all of these houses, Richard Morris Hunt, who was one of the judges, deemed it in the top 4 of the 38 that were there were represented. So the other 2 are the Farmer's Cottage at Edgewood and the house at Edgewood. And David R. Brown was involved with those as well, but it was all Mitchell's idea, and he had to, knew exactly how he wanted things to be built. And then he had to be told architecturally what had to happen to make that occur. So when he moved to Edgewood, Rosebank was the house that stood on the property, and you can see the addition of a kind of a rustic overhang over a side door there that's kind of incongruous with the house itself. And then the later house, Edgewood 1872, postcard saying home of Ick Marvel. And if you drive down Forest Road or Edgewood Way, this is the house today, or not actually, it's not current, it's a couple years old, but it's now broken up into apartments, so it does not appear as it used to be. From an artistic standpoint, he did not consider himself an artist. He was one of 4 advisors that was brought in when Yale in 1865 started the Yale School of Art, and was very active at Yale in the area of art. And this was his painting taken from the top of his hill in the area where Hopkins School is, and looking down into New Haven. And if this was in person, you would see the Lighthouse Point in the far right hand at the horizon, and the New Haven Sound, the harbor. And it's just truly delightful. And the interesting fact with this is that he actually made the frame to go with it. And this is the most elaborate, gorgeous family tree I have ever seen. This is the Mitchell oak, where he has added all the information from the family tree into this gorgeous illustration. So he also had an association with Louis Comfort Tiffany through family connections. Tiffany's first wife was from the Woodbridge family, and Donald Grant Mitchell's brother married Tiffany's sister. So they were very familiar with each other. The Mitchells were strong advocates for Tiffany and were instrumental in getting Tiffany glass, stained glass windows out of New York and into Yale University buildings and into their church in Westville. So that was very important. Mitchell's other role, other than the Connecticut Cottage at the Centennial Exposition, was serving as chairman of the Judges of the Decorative Arts, in which Tiffany exhibited 3 oils and 6 watercolors. And at that time, Mitchell discussed his concern that American art was lagging behind the rest of the world and offered that stained glass could be an area where we could make a large contribution. And he was a strong advocate, particularly in urban settings of houses, to use stained glass to let in light, but to block out the view of your neighbor, because people were in such close proximity and often didn't have great things to view when they were dealing with all of the sanitary issues of the growing industrialized cityscapes. And artistically, I've never seen tombstones, gravestones that look like this, but this is the Mitchell plot at the Woodbridge Cemetery, and they're meant to look like naturalistic stones with a simple, picturesque kind of stick font of the name and the dates of each individual of the family. That does say Donald Grant Mitchell, but that's his son's dates, if that's confusing. But it's absolutely charming, and nowhere have I seen tombstones that look like this. So I know that he had a hand in developing those before he passed away. And he even did a wonderful drawing or map of the Woodbridge Cemetery, which you can see in the middle as a small blue rectangle about a third of the way from the top. And then at the lower section, that's West Rock there with the West River flowing down, and to the left is New Haven and Westville and New Haven. So he really enjoyed this whole map making process and often did it to just for pure pleasure. I found scraps of paper at the Beinecke drawing the different train lines headed out of New York, the Hudson line, the New Haven line, just on scraps of paper. And this is a drawing that he did to commemorate a trip that he took with his daughter Minnie through Eastern Connecticut, heading over to Salem and Norwich, and then up to the Hartford area, and then back down around again, supplemented with some pictures from Edgewood. And this is the man we've come to know and love, and the way I like to think of him, picking rhododendron in the spring and standing there in front of the house. Before I move into the parks, I want to just back up a little bit to talk about the park movement and its origins. And part of what was happening in the US with the industrialization and the high level of immigration into the country to fill all of these industrial jobs and the squeezing of residential tenements in the cities and sanitary conditions, cemeteries ran out of space and they started moving out. And Mount Auburn Cemetery really started the rural cemetery movement in the US and is outside of Cambridge and is just one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. It's an arboretum, it has beautiful architecture, the topography is wonderful, the plantings of trees and the way the whole place is set up is just very, very pleasing. And it became not only a place for visiting your relatives, it also became a resting place as a way to get out of the city. And that started to take meaning in saying, aha, this is really just a park. That coupled with what was seen in England, specifically at Birkenhead, of parks being designed for people of all socioeconomic backgrounds. Prior to Birkenhead in Liverpool, parks really were related to royal palaces and the grounds, and those were considered parks, and they were only open certain times and for certain people to go. And Birkenhead made it parkland accessible to all, and actually had housing around the outside and a little bit on the inside of the park itself, and really served as the model to get going with Central Park. And Central Park kind of addresses all of those issues with being open to everyone, with an area, a formal area that it's called the Promenade, and is open to everybody parading and being seen and seeing other people. But there are also remote areas of the park, as you know from experiencing the park yourself. There's a series of types of drives of to keep the traffic at heavily trafficked areas separate from walk paths and tertiary paths. And then there's areas for organized play. There's areas for relaxation. So it addressed the needs of large groups of people. And that really set the precedent for other cities and saying, aha, this is the solution to our problems. This is where we can get fresh air. It was really recognized, and Olmsted in particular, the restorative value of fresh air and communing with nature. And this was very important. And luckily, New Haven had some wonderful geographic and topographical interest in West Rock and East Rock, kind of cornering the city. It also had the interesting aspect of the New Haven Green and the 9 square grid, and the elms lining the green. But what we also had was by 1888, this crazy amount of industry, and we were really a hub of transportation between railroads, freighters, and boasted about being third in size and wealth in New England. But in that boast, we're a little short-sighted, because I took a hard look at when similar New England cities, and I looked at New Haven, Bridgeport, Hartford, Springfield, Worcester, and Providence, created their first parks. And those are highlighted, that decade is highlighted in yellow. So you see New Haven and Springfield are kind of last to the game in the 1880s. We're also last with regard to what the population was before you took the time to create a park. And we were at 62,882 when East Rock was designed, and Bridgeport was at 7,560 when Seaside Park was created by Olmsted. So you can see that we were behind in thinking about the needs of our people. We were so focused on infrastructure issues that parks were not seen as an immediate need as trash and health. And it wasn't really recognized that parks could help with that health issue. So parks at that time were looking, I'm just showing you these as examples of the more biomorphic design rather than a town square. And squares existed throughout New Haven, but they were rather small in stature. But a park had more of this kind of a feel, with meandering paths leading to areas that you couldn't see at just one glance of the area. And Mitchell was writing about parks. And the park represents not only a demand for space and trees, but a revival and reassertion of country instincts, which the city associations are only too apt to unfold and entune. So you lose your country feeling without that park. So he's also reflecting upon, the more you've built up the city, then the less good spaces there are for parks themselves. And then he starts talking about, the politics of parks, and you're never going to make everybody happy by your decision of where you're going to put a park. But at the same time, if you build a park, no one has ever complained that, oh my gosh, we have a park. Isn't that bad news? So he's really thinking about parks and then really gets specific about what he would like to see in parks. They should be located and accessible to all classes. So that's ringing true everywhere. And nice that it's really being highlighted as first on Mitchell's list, that there's a mix of passive and active recreation, that there are views in and out. There are shade trees and they should be labeled. And I love this, should not mix with Trotting Park, and that's a direct reference to Hamilton Park, which existed right next to what would become Edgewood Park. And that they shouldn't be fluffy and stuffy, that it's really about creating a natural situation to some degree, or to most degree, and not going for the fluffy stuff that you would see in a royal park or a royal garden. I'm not going to go into how the park commission began or how it worked, but I just wanted to highlight that Simeon Baldwin and Henry Blake were key players, along with the president of Yale, to even start the discussion of we need a park before it got to the city level. And they continued with their quest for parks. This is Mitchell's plan for East Rock Park, completed in 1882, and it hangs in the Trowbridge Environmental Center at the base of the park. And what Mitchell tried to do with this park, similar to his drawing style of the maps that you've seen, is tried to subordinate the walks and roads and plantings to the grander features of interest, under the conviction that the things best worth seeing there will always be the rocks and woods and views as nature has shaped them. So he was trying to maximize what nature had provided. And to that end, he did create, this is another published drawing that could be handed out, focused on interesting bridges, both footbridges and traveling bridges, vehicular bridges. He focused on creating primary entrances, widening the roads, changing the shape of roads, grading of roads, roads that would take you and present interesting views both in and outside of the park, blasting some of the rock off the face of the rock that was doomed to eventually fall and create unsafe conditions, building a retaining wall all along the drive up. He was most concerned with people feeling safe in this park. And if the roadway did not feel safe as you were heading up the hill, you were not relaxed, you were not having fun, you were not communing with nature. At the summit was designed later, when the Soldiers and Sailors Monument that you see the plinth for there on the right was coming to be, and the restaurant in the lower middle there, you see, that overlooks the view. The lowest part is overlooking the view toward New Haven. So this does look very similar to the Allegheny Commons top, but you can see the use of evergreens in the center with a pathway going through that really kind of separated the right and the left side. So it did create intrigue and wonder about what's over on the other side. We also have drawings of cross sections of this area that he's done, and of rustic seats along the way. He was very concerned that things look natural and they be rustic and not, fitting in with nature versus not. And then he did use some shrubbery and some perennials, and presented a list of those perennials, majority of which are native and were meant to just go wild and take care of themselves. And here's some current pictures just to show you all of those things. The pathway going up to the monument, you can see, is lined with Yucca filamentosa, which was on his list. The curvy drive with the retaining wall, leaving you knowing there's a view off to the right when I get up to that curve, but what's around the corner to the left? I don't know. And you're eager to continue along that pathway. Bridge and another view of walls. And then we have lovely views of what it looked like through postcards and photographs, and I've just shared a couple of them. But what I really found interesting was the fare round trip was 50 cents to get to the top by wagon. And this was not something that was affordable to the common man or common family to be able to do. So here's this great park that really is not accessible to all. Here's a current picture just so that you can see the impact of 91. And I wanted to read, so what the dilemma the park commission was then faced with was, okay, now we need to think about new parks. This was a highly successful park, even though it didn't address all needs. Number one, it's beautiful. Number two, it is, highly visited. But what they were dealing with was the politics of park making, which there are books written about. And I'm going to read part of a letter that was written by a Dr. Foster, president of the Medical Association, to the Palladian, talking about and advocating for seaside parks. Below Worcester Square, there's a very large population that's constantly growing and becoming more crowded. The dwellings of these people are built upon the great factories that fill the air with dust and intensify the heat of the atmosphere during the summer. A large part of the wealth of our city is invested in these factories, and the army of workers employed by them are the first to be considered in the development of the park system. In every other part of the city, open fields are accessible, and while the purchase of park-size sites is a wise step toward providing for the future, the parks themselves are not at present a necessity. Not so in the region to which I refer. The people there need all the open space they can get, and they need it now. I was on one occasion called to the house of a most respectable man living in this crowded part of the city. I found his only child extremely sick with cholera. 6 children had died of the disease in the immediate neighborhood within 1 week. To keep the child in such a place meant certain death. To go to the country was impossible on account of expenses. I stated the fact to the mother, a very intelligent and devoted woman, and for days she walked with her child to East Rock Park and remained there from early morning until evening to secure the pure air that is of such importance in the management of cholera. Her unwearying exertions undoubtedly saved her child's life. During July and August, men can be seen sitting upon the upper and lower greens all night long, watching over sick children. They understand that to remain at home in a crowded tenement means death to their children, and in their love, they will walk long distances after a hard day's labor to place their children in the pure air of the parks. I cannot see, as often as I do, these wearying effects of parents who are already greatly fatigued by their regular work in the shops, without feeling that the available spots on our waterfronts, which are near to the crowded quarters of the city, should be purchased and speedily as possible converted into public parks. So that was, I thought, just very dramatic and illustrative of not only New Haven, but what other cities were experiencing. And the article here, I just put in because it highlights the importance of, they're calling him Ick Marble, not Donald Grant Mitchell. They reference Donald Grant Mitchell of Edgewood. So this reputation precedes him, and he is hired to complete the rest of the parks. And there indeed is a park system. I did a lot of research, and I only found this late in my research that there was actually a planned system versus saying if you have a bunch of parks, you have a park system because you have the numbers. So this is very, very important. And I'm going to kind of walk you through from right to left. The first one, Morris Cove Park, is actually Nathan Hale Park. The one up the road on Townsend Avenue, B, is Beacon Hill Park and is Fort Hill. And if you go across the river to Water Street Park, you see that right on the water. Thank you to the doctor for writing the letter. And if you cross back over, you see Grapevine Point Park. And then further up the Quinnipiac River, you see in Fairhaven portion of town, Quinnipiac Park. And then you cross over to F, which is East Rock Park. Then further left to Beaver Pond Park. Then we have West Rock, which is H. And you can tell by the shape of I that that's Edgewood Park area. J down at the bottom left is Oyster Point or City Point Park. And in the center, you have the New Haven Green. So Donald Grant Mitchell was hired to design these, and we have designs for a lot of them, and we have write-ups for some that we don't have designs for, and we have references in park notes and city notes about consultations and in correspondence as well. So this is his plan for Fort Hale Park. And it's an absolutely beautiful drawing, and you will love looking at this on Saturday if you can get to the Whitney Library at the New Haven Museum. It's just outstanding. Here's a close-up of one section of a tidal pond that he's created. So he's done a lot of engineering to include a tidal pond that, again, will recede with the tides. And he works, there's going to be an electric trolley that gets out to this park. He works with the cliffside that you can see in that upper postcard to accentuate drives and walks so that you can have the great views. There's areas for picnicking, there's areas for playground areas. And what I found interesting is I always want to know what's the response of the public and what do people think? And definitely this park has been used, but what appeared in the paper I thought was really interesting, talking about his plan. It's an interesting document in that it shows Mr. Mitchell's rare taste and many original ideas on the subject of public parks. So still at this time, people are thinking of public parks as public squares, which is more Worcester Square kind of look to a park where it's very geometric and some diagonal walkways in the appropriate spots and plantings of trees, and then there's seating. So because of this using the land and maximizing the views and use of nature, it's a different take than simply putting a grid on top of an area. This is Fort Hill, and Fort Hill is often seen in, this is another book that talked about New Haven and its assets, and was really an Indian, there's a monument there now to the Indians or Native Americans of that area and their impact. And I believe there's some Indian burial grounds up there. And it was a fort during the war with Britain. And it is very natural, was never designed as a park. It really is just a place to go. And it's very wooded and very dense. And I've never walked up from Townsend Avenue, but there is a beautiful memorial that the Townsend family were instrumental in getting, highlighting the Native Americans of the area. So the next park was Waterside Park. And the doctor advocated for this spot near the Sargent factory, which you see on the right in the 1879 map, that huge factory. And then you see the open space that I've highlighted. That was dredged up, filled in with dump material and dredging from the water, as well as trash put in there to create a landmass there, which was done a lot along the New Haven shoreline, as we know from the highway, I-95. But this postcard that you see in the upper left shows the Sargent factory, and to the right is that park. And I don't know, and what's disturbing to me is the design of this park does not seem to mirror any of the drawings that we have for Mitchell's designs for the park area. While we do see trees around the outer edge, the inner portion is just not clear. So Mitchell designed a park with secluded swimming, protected swimming with those beach, not beach, but an area where you can submerge and get cooled off in the water bathhouse, and then an area for a ballpark in the center, and then tree-lined geometric because of the geometric form of the land itself. And then he offered up a couple other options that were, one was more prettified or more Victorian, I would say, in that second one, that lead me to believe that there wasn't a clear program for that space. They really didn't know what they wanted to do to address the needs of the people who live there. But I think the simpler was the better. But the look of this is a much more naturalistic path flowing curvy lines. But again, it's hard to tell. We don't have any other documentation to look at. And now that park, it no longer exists at all. And as you were hitting that interchange of 95 and 91, if you dare to look off to your right, that was where the park was in the Long Wharf area, and is no more. And when you look at this map, you see it labeled Quinnipiac Park. That's not accurate, but that's the next park that we're going to talk about. So it's just over the bridge there of the Mill River. And it's here highlighted on the 1879 as Grapevine Point Park. And just to the left of that highlighted area, you see the Yale Boathouse. And that was part of that area. And Mitchell's plan for this one was really quite interesting because he created this kind of biomorphic, quasi-naturalistic edge line versus the hard lines that existed, and really excavated to create this park, which is a really interesting concept when you keep filling in to create parkland in other places. And you can see there's the point there in the middle. You can see the Yale Boathouse in the lower left-hand corner, and ballpark areas, and then another pavilion for relaxation. So it's a small-ish area, and this is how it appears today. And as you're going over the Q Bridge, if you want to spot it, look for the wind turbine that's located on the right-hand side of James Street there, and you'll know exactly where this park lies. Quinnipiac Park was never developed until the 19th century as a waterside park for swimming and just hanging out. And further up that you see currently is a playground area and park, and quite nice. Beaver Ponds Park was never developed either. It always had extreme drainage issues that even when the Olmsted firm came in the 1900s to try and address, became a problem. And you can see it now, part of the Hill House High School ball fields there in the lower left-hand side, the police training area kind of midway up, and then Southern Connecticut State University on the left-hand side of it. So it's definitely park space, but it's not organized, structured, design space. And this is West Rock. This is Mitchell's drawing. You can see a lot of topo lines there, and you can barely make out the red lines for paths and roads that he added. And this was what was published in the paper that talked about proposed roads, proposed paths. This was always a place that was visited because of the Three Judges Cave. So from the earliest time, this was a destination and people hiked up. So it wasn't as if they were creating a park. It was just refining and taking a look at best approaches, again, to maximize the natural beauty of the site. Edgewood Park is fascinating because this is labeled Map D, and I have not seen any other maps for Edgewood Park in Mitchell's hand. And we do know that in the far left, you can see that blue line, and that's West River. And to the left of West River was the land that Mitchell donated to the park, and to the right is the land purchased by the city to create the park. And we know that Mitchell was consulted on this double-lined divided drive, and the city wanted to put that drive all the way through, heading up Edgewood Avenue toward Edgewood, all the way through, and Mitchell strongly objected and said there's no purpose. The purpose of that drive is to create, to highlight the residential area on either side of the street, and you don't need to do that cutting through a park. And they were compelled to do that, and he convinced them not to do that. We know that Mitchell had a lot to say and a lot to do. And you can see at the very top left the outline of Hamilton Park track. So the racetrack up there that was eventually demolished. So it's a little bit of a mystery in terms of actual drawings of Mitchell's for Edgewood Park, and I've yet to find where others have landed if this is Map D, because A, B, and C are somewhere. But we know that there's a lot of detail that Mitchell had a hand in, and these just illustrate a few of those: the rustic pavilion at the top of that entrance there, and the curving lines curving in, the rustic footbridge. And here's the way it appears now. And the last park is Oyster Point or City Point. And if you go to Shell and Bones Restaurant, formerly the Chart House, then you know exactly the area that we're talking about. And Bayview Park, we do not have a plan for in Mitchell's hand, but we have his write-up of his plan that he presented, and we have several drawings that address how he dealt with the shoreline and the riprap and keeping the land from falling off into the water. The problem with this was the street bisecting it, Halleck Street. But I think eventually, from what I can tell, that was eliminated. And again, he put in a tidal pond for the enjoyment of sailing little boats and this bridge that went over. And then he had a way of stopping the system. So in the winter, it could stay at one level and freeze and be used as an ice skating pond. And then the drive around the outside, it was never meant to be a swimming park. The drive around the outside was lined with trees, which created a very finished kind of ornamental look and kind of finished it off. I really like the look of it. But now today, if you drive by, you can see that memorial that you see right there, but you can't see the water because I-95 goes right through the middle of it. And all that's left on the other side are ballparks for playing baseball. And Mitchell I never found any request by the Park Commission for him to take a look at the town green, but he did 3 variations of the lower green and 1 for the upper green, which are kind of overwhelming. And the last one, the third one, actually, you can see the number of shrubs and trees that are sprinkled in all throughout. But the lines themselves are the current lines, pathway lines of the green. But that could never have accommodated any of the functions that the green holds. And so a simpler plan lining the edge with trees is what was adopted. And in conclusion, I'm showing a picture here of Mitchell that because it reminds us that he was instrumental in securing Beecher Park in Westville, which became the home of the Donald Grant Mitchell Memorial Library. And there's a book plate from the library mimicking the picture. And oftentimes you don't hear about how wonderful or the impact that you've had in your life and your work on things. And I think something much later, talking about the New Haven parks, I think reflects on a lot of people, but is so interesting to think that the park is considered and was considered the park system very important and very well done and very well executed. And we have Mitchell to thank for his part in that. That concludes the presentation, and I'm looking forward to any questions you might have.
Hi, I'll help you with this. Let me just shut off. We're gonna keep the quote up, correct? I think.
Oh, you can shut that off. That's fine.
Okay. Oh, that didn't do it. So, like, what I mean, I think the first question is that kind of comes up is, how did you find such clearly a passion for Mitchell's work? I mean, what kind of delved you into becoming so versed in all of his work?
The more you dig, the more you find you don't know. And maybe this occurs with any project. I tend to enjoy research, but I was always curious about that house on Forest Road, and I never knew anyone that knew anything about it. And Tom Peters, the archivist at Hopkins, had a conversation with me, and I was talking about wanting a local research project, not something in Boston. And he said, "You should find out more about Mitchell and his park designs." And I said, "Who is Mitchell?" So, immediately, I started at Hopkins, and who has a collection that was shared by his daughter with them, a beautiful portrait, the watercolor that I shared, some silver commemorative silver pieces. And then I headed to the New Haven Museum, where I became quick friends with the librarians, who most librarians are very intrigued with what you're studying and what you're interested in, and are so helpful and spend so much time with you. And I really camped out in the Whitney Library for a long time, and then hit the road, going to other libraries in Boston, in Massachusetts, and the Beinecke, pouring over the Beinecke. And I just wanted to, copy everything in the Beinecke collection as well. But you just sit there and a picture gets painted of this person, and I saw him as a kind, thoughtful, nature-loving person who understood people but didn't need to be the center of attention, but a strong advocate for making improvements in the city of New Haven. And I was just very intrigued by that, and just kept going. And I can honestly say I did the bulk of my research 10 years ago, and there really wasn't a venue or an opportunity for sharing that made sense around interest. And this anniversary has been crucial, and has helped renew my research. And I, I've talked to Barbara, and we've talked about the more you poke, the more you find. And when she went down to Charleston, I said, check out the Miles Bruton house. That was where Mary Pringle grew up, and she's associated with Middleton's of Middleton Place, which is, wonderful landscape. So the landscape connection. And Mitchell's daughter, who moved out to Chicago, married Ryerson, and Mitchell was out for the World Exposition in 1893 at Columbian Exposition. So he got to see, I believe, there's nothing written, but he was there at the time of the Columbian Exhibition. So I think he saw it. And then I've always been trying to find the link between Olmsted and Mitchell, thinking their paths must have crossed. They knew so many of the same people. And I have not been able to find that connection. So you search and you dig, and then you take another path and try something else, and then you meet someone who says, "Did you ever hear about da 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 da?" And then you start digging some more. So it's a lot of fun.
No, I mean, you can hear the passion in your voice about it. Like you can tell when people are very, very interested, and the rabbit holes they go down. So it's really fascinating to kind of see where that process comes from, with our speakers. We have a lot of questions pouring in, so I'm just going to kind of read them off and see where we go.
Okay.
Did you come across any information on Milton Stewart, who owned East Rock at the time, or the involvement in that?
I did, and I just I did not refresh my memory for this presentation about that. There was a lot of interesting folks up on East Rock, and Yale owned property at East Rock. So the whole East Rock story is a fascinating one. And I don't have on the tip of my tongue information that I can really delve into that tonight.
Are you aware of any of Mitchell's other paintings being available for public viewing in different places?
No, I am not. Other than the portrait that a lot of us saw at the Mitchell Library the night of the kickoff with Barbara. There's another, I think there are 3 portraits mentioned in the Waldo Dunn book, and one of them Hopkins has, and then that watercolor. And I don't know of other art pieces. There are doodlings in some of the Beinecke material, but nothing rendered other than what I found at the Whitney Library.
Apparently there was a restaurant on top of East Rock at a period of time.
Yeah.
And there are aerial photos taken. So there are aerial photos taken of it in the 40s, and are attendee is asking, is there more information, or where could you look to see what else was up there, and more information on the buildings that were up there?
I would come to the Whitney Library, and there is information about, a lot of information about East Rock. I don't remember dates of when the restaurant was opened and when it closed. There is information about the dedication of the memorial and the fact that the 2-mile stretch between New Haven and East Rock was lined with people, and that people followed and walked all the way up East Rock for General Sherman and another general who were part of that dedication. So there's a lot of interesting facts about East Rock. And then there's, more recent information before I moved to Connecticut about concerts at the top of the summit. And it would be, I'm sure the Parks Department is cut so thin, it's so bare bones in terms of resources that they have available, that there's lots more that could be done, but there's more important maintaining of the trails and the park itself that the Friends are very active in, but there needs to be, leadership at the park department level, and there could be more help in that area before there's other uses of the park considered. Of all the roads that are up there, you can see when you're up there that certain ones are closed off because it's just too hard to maintain and too hard to monitor from a safety standpoint. All of that property, it's big.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the other questions that was coming up about maintaining the pathways and kind of restoring them, because some of them are closed off. And I think, like you said, it is a function of just space and time and not necessarily effort, but the manpower to be able to both monitor and maintain those.
Yes, and Friends groups are instrumental in helping to jumpstart processes within the city, but they really can't take. Well, I've seen them take leadership roles in other, like at Harkness Estate, really got the restoration of those Beatrix Sprand gardens going, and they've raised all kinds of money for restoration there to happen. So there is a lot of power in Friends groups, but there needs to be lobbying for the funds for Parks Department to be able to, conquer what they can. They're doing the best they can with the resources they have.
So one of the other questions is, and we'll see how this fits in, is there an opportunity to restore cultivated landscapes similar to Prospect Park in Brooklyn and Central Park? I think it's more to like restore some of ours, or to look for newer areas to kind of build up, I think is the way they're trying to ask it.
I think, with looking at Prospect Park, they did so much research to figure out how the park is used and how to address the needs. So, you talk about, they did focus groups to talk about different groups of people and how different groups of people, not just random population people, use the park. So they hit every way you can differentiate groups of people to figure out how to best serve from an access point standpoint, safety, activities, and then incorporated new maintenance practices and more sustainable plantings and all that kind of thing. And that could definitely happen at some of the larger parks. All of the parks that currently exist could be better than what they are. And it almost takes something really bothersome before something changes, if something is okay. Or it takes somebody who's a very, very strong advocate. So that really could happen if there was perceived as an overwhelming or a convincing argument made for the need for such a thing. And just takes the right people.
And I guess I'll close with the question that kind of looks at the work that you do, working in this field. For you, looking at the word that comes to me is very prolific in his work with all the parks, and looking at how to arrange things and how to make paths and mysteries and set things up to make it a little bit of an adventure. Is there an opportunity for you personally to have room to be able to do that kind of work, and kind of how do you focus? How has it influenced your work in looking at different ways to set up locations?
Parks are so different because the biggest difference is scale in terms of what you're doing, and program. When I drive by Edgewood Park, I don't walk through unless I'm walking through with other people. It doesn't have a feeling of safety. It's very enclosed. So you have to look at a setting and analyze it in a lot of different ways. So you have to do an assessment of what you have and figure out what you're trying to do, and then what has to change and what you can alter to make that happen. And oftentimes it's easier for me to explain in terms of a residential property, because if you go to a home that you go in the backyard and there's a huge drop off and it's a blank slate, it is the most boring thing to look at, this huge expanse of lawn. And you automatically then start talking to a client about, how do you use this space? And then you get into, how do you want to use this space? What would make you use this space more? What are you looking for? So you're always looking at what's the problem? What am I trying to solve with any design project? And start with that. Or you're starting with a setting or a project that, if you're designing a roof garden, then you're starting with, I've got a roof and it's a certain size and this is what the client wants. So it all depends on the property, but you start with an assessment of the property, its conditions, and then you get into, how do you want to use that? If somebody says, I want to be able to play croquet with my family, then I look at it and think, well, then a great big open lawn is exactly what you need. But if they talk about like a play area outside for the children, and I say, when you're inside and you're looking out the back, where are you looking from? Oh, my kitchen window is over here. So to me, the playscape is going to go out that window, probably in that direction. And how does that correspond with your outdoor living space where you want to go and sit? Do you have a patio or an extension of that? Is there living space that you want to have? Is there garden space that you want to have? Oh, I want a vegetable garden too. Well, you don't just stick it over there because it's out of sight, because it's not as attractive as a living area or a native plant garden. You look at, where's the sun? So you look at all kinds of things when you're trying to problem solve. And that's the same thing with, analyzing a park and what's working well with the park. Is it near an area where there are people living? I mean, there weren't people living when the 95 and 91 went in. So parks disappeared, even though Mitchell said, once you have a park, you got a park, you don't get rid of it. Well, in the 1940s, New Haven took a look at their parks and said, up, gone. And there are more parks Lighthouse Point Park didn't exist then, but does exist now, was a 20th century park, and had ballparks. And so things exist out of need and out of serving the people that would use them. I mean, you're not going to put a park just to complete that ring if there's no residential center near where you're going to, add to that ring of parks. It doesn't make any sense. So you look carefully at the situation and analyze it and say, what do I have? What are the existing conditions? What's the existing setup? Who lives around here? Who wants a park? Who accesses the park? How do they access it? They just made changes in Bridgeport to Beardsley Park with the anniversary of Olmsted as well, his birth year. And they did some major work halfway through the park so that there's a new access point to the park to serve the residents who are right across the street, but couldn't cross the street and get into the park because they didn't have access. So they would have had to walk all the way around to another entrance. And they said, I don't need that. I'm tired. I just got home from work. Now they have direct access to an area where there are ballparks, picnic areas, and a playground. So there's much more visibility and much more use in that area, as well as a lovely new bust of Olmsted, sitting to greet them as they walk in.
I know I said this last one, but somebody put one more up, and I thought this would be a good one, good way to end.
Okay.
Your favorite New Haven park and why?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I have a true favorite where it depends on what I'm doing, I think, and how sometimes I go up to the top of East Rock Park and I'll sit up there and I love it because you're removed from the city and you can look and you can think, and there's usually some people around. But again, it's a comfort level of being in a park. And when I want to sit, I'll go there. If I'm walking with friends, I'll go to Edgewood Park. I used to live in Woodbridge, so it was fairly close by. I haven't spent a lot of time at Nathan Hale Park. I really like Worcester Square as a park because I like the size of it. I like the neighborhood vibe. I like the fact that you see your friends and neighbors. And I like the fact that people have beautified the edges of the park and that it is more people focused. It may be over monumentalized, but I think it's a true people's neighborhood park, and I like the vibe of that, and I like the festivals and activities that go on, and I love the cherry trees. So that's a good one.
It's always a tough one. People ask you your favorite of anything.
Yes, because you like
depends on your mood, right?
For certain reasons. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate, and it was very informative tonight. Our library is going to have things on display this weekend on Saturday. You can come check that out. Thank you, all of you, for joining us tonight. We do have another talk next week. It's up on our website. Uncovering their history, African American and Native American burials in Hartford Ancient Burying Ground, 1640 to 1815. It is on Wednesday, so that's a change for us. We usually do our talks on Thursday, but it is Wednesday of next week at 6 o'clock. It is another virtual conversation. So we hope that you'll join us. And again, thank you for all of you for joining us. And Leslie, thank you for taking the time, and your presentation was wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Khalil, for all your help.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.